Good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Roxana Marcoci, the acting chief curator of photography, and the David Deckman senior curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art. And it's a true pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's forum on contemporary photography, Statements on Style, which takes inspiration from a phrase by Alexander Liberman, who served as art director of Vogue from 1941 to 1962. Lieberman used to tell his staff that while not every photograph was necessarily a fashion picture, any photograph, even a documentary image seemingly as distant from the studio lighting and high production value of a fashion shoot, could be a statement essentially about style. Lieberman's prescient remark, made in reference to Walker Evans' Citizen in downtown Havana, a picture of a black man sporting a white linen suit and straw boater hat, anticipated just how porous the borders between fashion photography and other genres would become over the course of time. This forum focuses on liminal images of expressive style. The first collection of fashion photographs is a small book of performative acts by the Countess of Castiglione, a 19th century Italian aristocrat centered on the cult of personal beauty, who began posing in various looks from her own closet in 1856. Her collaboration with Pierre-Louis Pearson produced over 400 portraits in which she assumed not just the role of model, but also of art director. Still, despite the profound cultural influence of sartorial images, the term fashion photography came to be largely relegated to the periphery of critical discourse, often dismissed as commercial or ephemeral, cast under the umbrella of the editorial picture, and seen as lacking the political weight of photojournalism or the intellectual rigor of conceptual image making. Yet perhaps more than other genres, fashion photography has mobilized and deconstructed its own visual codes, tapping into potent economies of desire to shape visual culture, construct identities, and challenge aesthetic and social norms. Take the banner image for tonight's session by the artist-activist Kwame Brathwaite, a key voice in the Pan-Africanist movement of the 1950s and 60s, co-founder of the African Jazz Art Society and studios in Harlem, who played a key role in popularizing the catchphrase, "Black is beautiful." Brathwaite used fashion imagery not just as an aesthetic statement, but as a radical act of empowerment, celebrating Black identity and self-determination at a time when such representations were largely absent from mainstream media. His photographs of the Grandassa models, a collective of women who embrace natural hairstyles and African-inspired fashion, challenge Eurocentric beauty standards and redefine the lasting power of photography in the development of racial pride. At the same time, another luminary, Richard Avedon, just 22 years old, began working as a freelancer primarily for Harper's Bazaar. Initially denied the use of a studio by the magazine, he photographed models on the streets, in nightclubs, at the circus, and on the beach. Catching the eye of Harper's art director Alexei Brodovich, he became in 1946 the chief photographer for the magazine. An extraordinary portraitist, Avedon relentlessly reshaped the field until his death in 2004 at the age of 81, and was hailed as the creator of the new vision. His work had remarkable political gravitas. For Bazaar's November 1964 issue, Avedon constructed a double portrait by holding a cropped picture of his former high school friend, the literary prodigy James Baldwin, over his own. Their legendary partnership for the 1964 book, Nothing Personal, just months after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the assassination of President J.F. Kennedy, articulated the fierce power that images and writing can hold on portraying the psyche of a nation in a state of spiritual crisis. In the 1980s and 1990s, alternative publications like the British fashion magazine ID And artists like Wolfgang Tillmans pioneered an off-the-cuff style that reshaped mainstream fashion photography, blending do-it-yourself dress, music, and lifestyle. A visual polyglot, Tillmans understood the potential of the wandering image, the migrant, incessantly decentralized image moving and performing across communication platforms, from museum walls to magazine pages, music records, videos, artist books, leaflets, Instagram, and more. This kind of image has been critical to his embrace of mobility, diversity, and mutability of sexual identity in the world. By transmitting, sharing, and setting images free by multiplying their lives, Tillmans proposed a democratized experience of art, fashion, and politics. At present, a new generation of photographers like Tyler Mitchell further blur the distinction between portraiture and editorial commissions, interlacing images and fashion to explore the intimacies and vast beauty of Black empowerment. In 2018, at the age of 23, Mitchell made history as the first African-American photographer to shoot the cover of Vogue in its 125-year history, a portrait of Beyoncé, using the opportunity to show the Black body in its full resplendence. By comparison, Irving Penn, whose stark graphic sensibility defined a generation of fashion photography, was 26 when his first photograph ran on the magazine's cover in 1943. Hired at Vogue by Lieberman, he took his first color picture, a still life, which became the October 1st cover. He would go on to make the photographs for 164 more Vogue covers over the next 60 years. Also, in 1944, MoMA opened the exhibition Our Clothes Modern, curated by architect Bernard Rudowski, which surveyed the transformations of dress and body tattoos in the industrial era. Although pictures, including life-size blow-ups, played an important role in the exhibition, the accompanying catalog notably lamented the lack of pictorial documents from the likes of Vogue, which did not give permission to reproduce any of its fashion photographs. The publication instead probed the relationality between genders and clothing with infographics and critically noted the persistence of pointless appendages, such as the 24 packets vestiary design, assessing what worked across culture and what needed to change along with the pace of modernity. Even though the implications of art and fashion were recognized from an early moment, fashion photography was not a focus of the museum's program for decades, appearing only as part of larger exhibitions of studio portraiture. It was not until 2004 that Susan Kismarik and Eva Respini, photographer curators at MoMA, organized a contemporary exhibition entirely dedicated to the topic, Fashioning Fiction in Photography since 1990, which traced the interlacing of two threads, the cinematic and the snapshot aesthetic. In 2017, Paola Antonelli, senior curator in architecture and design with Michelle Miller-Fisher, Stephanie Kramer, and Anna Burkhardt, organized Items, Is Fashion Modern?, which brought together some of the most iconic objects in fashion, like the hoodie, the little black dress, the Wonder Bra. On that occasion, the film department presented a concurrent series, Fashioning Forward documentary, which screened, among others, Paris is Burning, winner of the Grand Jury Prize at the 1991 Sundance Film Festival, Jenny Livingston's documentary about the ball culture of New York City's gay and transgender communities. In 2023, the museum published Grace Wales Bonner, Dream in the Rhythm, Visions of Sound and Spirit in the MoMA collection, an artist book created by the acclaimed London-based designer Grace Wales Bonner in conjunction with her Artist Choice exhibition organized by Michelle Kuo, currently chief curator and publisher. From its first image on the front cover, a double portrait of Coffee and Ebony by Dawood Bey, the book drew up multi-sensory connections between pictures and poems, music and fashion, gestures and vibrations in the artist's own words, defining an archive of soulful expression. Tonight's forum comes at a particularly exciting moment of international attention to the intersections between art and mass culture. Next week, the Met's Costume Institute debuts Superfine, Tailoring Black Style, curated by the Institute's curator in charge, Andrew Bolton, and cultural historian Monica L. Miller. Miller's 2009 book, Slaves to Fashion, Black Dandyism, and the Styling of Black Diasporic Identity examine the role of sartorial expression in shaping Black subjectivity in the Atlantic diaspora. Meanwhile, in Paris, Louvre Couture, art objects, fashion objects, underscores how fashion and art history have always been in intimate dialogue. This fall, the Armory will host the North American premiere of Drajal Harel's Monkey Off My Back, or The Cat's Meow, a hybrid performance that channels dance, theater, design, and history through fashion. Featuring a large cast of dancers and actors wearing more than 60 Harel-designed looks, the work embodies style as a form of gesture and as a living, evolving language. Our program this evening looks at the history of fashion photography and its contemporary instantiations from varied perspectives, exploring the powerful myths that images can create and their potential to reconstruct social perception through dress, pose, staging, composition, and circulation. The recent cover by Douglas Coupland for Harper's Bazaar, Things Are Going to Be Okay, maps a photographic portrait against the history of the internet. Its geometric forms based on facial recognition techniques from 15 to 20 years back, an already nostalgic look at a now perfected apparatus that has absorbed the human biases implicit in AI technologies, in the proliferation of images online and on print, and in how photography works in lockstep with capitalism. Before welcoming our first speaker, I'd like to extend my appreciation to everyone who made this evening possible, including and especially my co-organizer for this session, Caitlin Ryan, assistant curator in the Department of Photography, and our colleagues Marion Tonde, department manager, and Megan Feingold, department coordinator. We especially wish to thank MoMA's exceptional audiovisual team, who has ensured everything runs smoothly this evening. And with great gratitude to all of our speakers, I hope you will join me in welcoming the incomparable Tina Barney to the podium.
Hello, everybody. What a fun subject matter. Fashion. Finally. Good. So here we are. Let's start. This is my mother, Brooklyn, 1930s. 4x5 glass plate negative taken by her father, my grandfather, a passionate amateur photographer, for her fashion portfolio. She was a model. And then fast forward 1948, married to my father. I'm 3 years old. They lived in New York City. And this is by George Hoyninga-Huene. So she was photographed by many well-known photographers. And I just want to say that fashion has been in my life since birth. I went on to start collecting photography by volunteering here at MoMA, but then fell in love with it, moved my family to a ski resort in the middle of nowhere, started taking pictures in Idaho, and that is when I realized the huge difference between the way people dressed, the way people moved, the way people acted, the way basically how they held themselves between Idaho, California, and the East Coast, New England, where I live today and go back in the summers. I started photographing there, and this is one of the first pictures I took in 1977. 1982, started using a view camera and focusing on family, again in the East Coast, showing very much how people dressed, how they moved, how they ate, what their lives were like, and made photographs that were 4 by 5 feet, which was revolutionary at that time. So these are some of the photographs that come out of my first book, Theater of Manners. Again, so very much about style, the way people acted, how they moved. I directed the people in the pictures. They were all people I knew. They were about family. This is my sister's wedding, 1985, but she was very elegant too, very much into fashion. Notice her dress, but also the gestures, and I directed people to sit where they were. Here again is my sister and her daughter. I was interested in how people dressed and also decorated their houses in the same way that they dressed, and almost as if their clothes matched their walls. This is my first job, Connoisseur magazine, in which someone asked me to choose the people, choose the place. This is my niece in my sister's house. First time I ever did an editorial job. This is my son. I used people in my pictures, for many, many decades. I photographed in Europe in 8 years, photographed in 6 different countries. Again, look at the way these young men are dressed. They're going to Eton College. I drove into Eton in London and saw these young men dressed in ties and tails. So that was a whole other project that really focused on everything about the way people moved and dressed. This is from the Fashion and Fiction show. Dennis Friedman was the first, photographic editor that I've ever worked with, and he hired Philip Lorca de Corsha, me, Larry Sultan, and really the first time that art photographers did fashion and worked for magazines. And I think that he is one of the most important people in the history of fashion, at least in America, and put us in places that we'd never been before. Here's Julianne Moore at the beginning of her career. This is in France, a family in France. I mean, funnily enough, he has this sort of soccer jacket on, but look how very elegant and formal they are. This is my first commercial job for Corcoran Realty, but this is the photograph of mine that they were interested in and sort of imitated. This kind of direction has followed my fashion work for 20 years. I started working with Norma Jean Marcus, my agent of today, and even today, the people that hire me want me to take pictures that look very much like the people that I've been photographing for myself for years and years. For 8 years, I did a project photographing traditions and rituals in New England towns. This is a group of people that made their own costumes, that Renaissance fairs, which really fascinated me. This is a fashion shoot, where I began to really have fun, work with interesting art directors. The interiors are very important to what I do too. My mother became an interior decorator, so the crossover between fashion and interior decoration were important. I photographed theater also. This is all combined with fashion. This is Richard Foreman, the great Richard Foreman. He let me go on the stage, and the actors performed for me. And it was just one of the most exciting things I've ever done. Here's another fashion shoot. I mean, what a fantastic room. Here's another play that I found, Target Margin, that let me get on the stage. To have actors and then to have these interesting costumes was better than my dreams. This is a fashion shoot I did. I always say to whoever hires me, the setting is more important than the people. You could give me the most interesting person in the world, but if I don't have a great setting, I'm not good with white seamless. I've never done that before and never probably ever will. I mean, look at this mural on the wall. Here's what's her name? Machine. Florence. I mean, she was like going to heaven. Everything she did. But look at the house they found. Look at the costume. Here's the Worcester group who let me photograph them for years, and they again performed for me. Would do different scenes. I'd get on the stage. Incredible thrill, and they would go on and do an act. And this is all with a 4x5 camera, umbrellas, lights, etc. This is a fashion shoot right after COVID. During COVID, actually, we had masks. Just a little car came up with the stylist, the model, and some clothes. This is where I live in Rhode Island. I found some of the places to go to. This just happened to be there. to me, it was just a thrill, but it was one of the first times where I had a model that really was an actress. This is during, practically it's snowing out in this little town I live in the middle of the winter. But I'd like to mention how important the great stylist is. I also started working with a prop designer. Here we go with Tom Brown. I mean, what a strange set, and also the actors were so different. That's David Harbour and Ann Dung. Why would you put those two people together? I mean, in a million years, and they were fantastic. And put David Harbour in a skirt. This is Vogue International, two models in a limo. This is a self-portrait. Chris Simmons is an art director I've worked with who I think is brilliant. This is really the first time I've had models who actually were acted, and it just made a huge difference. It was really fun. This is a Dior campaign, one of the first big campaigns I've ever done. A whole other animal than doing my own work. Very, very little sort of relaxed, you can do whatever you want, let things go kind of atmosphere. God, ooh. And this is for Gucci, my last job we just finished. And the choice of the I call them actors, the models are very important, and the setting. So thank you very much. I'd like to, also, I just want to say I'm doing a book on my fashion work with the Aperture next year, but I'd like to invite Kate Boer to come up here and talk. Kate's from Columbus. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Tina. Thanks to Roxana and Caitlin for organizing, and thank you also to Marion Tande, Megan Feingold, and MoMA's AV department for their help bringing us all together today. My research on the history of fashion photography came from an interest and a curiosity about the stark seeming divide between commercial photography and fine art photography. Historically, fashion photographs, persuasive, collaboratively produced documents used to promote clothing were rarely collected by museums, although that's certainly starting to change thanks to institutions like this one and many others. But while fashion photographs have not been collected throughout the 20th century, fashion photography was certainly present in museum spaces. Here we go. I've been especially excited by recent campaigns like Tyler Mitchell's shoot for Ferragamo at the Uffizi Gallery, where the artist posed with models and equipment among unframed Renaissance paintings. And in this campaign, we see Mitchell inserting himself into art history, deconstructing the fashion shoot, playing with long traditions of using mirrors to compose photographs and paintings. The year before, Stephen Meisel's Louis Vuitton campaign showed Les Essais before a range of paintings, including Claude Monet paintings at the Orangerie. And these images belong to a long and controversial tradition of fashion photography using museums and works of art as backdrops. In his book, Farewell to an Idea, art historian T.J. Clark called these images by Cecil Beaton, which are luminous photographs of models before Jackson Pollock paintings at Betty Parsons' gallery, the bad dream of modernism. And he accused them of reducing modern art to decoration and matching dresses to paint colors. But I struggle with that reading. These images were made by a gay man in a gallery owned by a woman for a magazine geared towards women. To me, that's not a nightmare, but a dream. And dismissing fashion photography as derivative or reductive or a misunderstanding of contemporary art misses a chance to understand how people saw art through magazines. And on a practical level, as Tina was just talking, backgrounds are important, and posing models amongst art and in settings like museums was a way to vary set backdrops of photographs from month to month in magazines. But I would argue that when models pose amongst artwork, the result is transporting. And these photographs engage with fashion's perennial need for change and novelty, but they tell us something about the viewership and reception of contemporary art. The Museum of Modern Art has long been a part of this story. Here's one more. In 1939, MoMA's new building became a location for fashion shoots, both officially and at times unofficially, I think. Dahlwolf's photographs show models in galleries and amongst sculptures and call out the works of art in captions. Here, MoMA's building is a glamorous destination for the well-dressed person. And not only did this offer MoMA publicity, it positioned New York as a cultural center in the US at a time during World War II when content from Europe was not as easily accessible. So these images show MoMA as a kind of spectacular backdrop for fashion photographs. These kinds of images did not only happen at MoMA, of course. This playful photo was taken at a Hans Arp exhibition at a gallery nearby. But MoMA was a true favorite. And in the 1940s, Vogue also experimented with making themed issues during the off-seasons, and one was dedicated to MoMA. And this cover is a rare fashion photograph that shows a work of art in front of a dress. In this case, this is Duchamp's Large Glass, now at the PMA in Philadelphia. And this image, the entire feature showed vaguely surrealist photos made throughout the building. But even after the war, MoMA was a go-to location for photographers who worked outside of studio settings. Gordon Parks's first credited photo in a New York magazine was shot right outside the museum's lauder entrance on 53rd Street. And early Richard Avedon photos also play with the lobby's windows and doors. Parks was deeply invested in crafting stories behind his photo shoots and would occasionally include contemporary art and backdrops, such as this kind of moody Vogue spread before a Louise Nevelson sculpture at a Pace gallery. Fashion shoots in museums require considerable demands of staff and present lots of conflicting needs. And by the 1960s, MoMA had a written policy about shoots and required a certain amount of artwork to be shown in photos, which was obviously enforced to mixed success, as we see in these photos by Louis Forer in an Alexander Calder exhibition where the sculptures are really hard to see. But then and now, staging photos in museums it really endures for a reason. And here I have more recent shoots at the Andy Warhol Museum, LACMA, and the Picasso Museum. And in all of these examples, the setting, the art, the clothes do equally important work, telegraphing notions of style to the viewer. Fashion has been in museums for a long time, and fashion photography deserves a happy place in collections as well. But museums need something tangible to acquire, be that contact sheets, layouts, prints, or magazines. So I hope for the continuation of print culture, because magazines are tactile and time-bound and collectible. They will tell future historians what we valued and how we saw. And I hope that, like Mitchell's photographs, it's an increasingly complicated, inclusive, and diverse picture. Thank you. I'm happy to welcome Antoine Sargent to the podium.
Thanks. Good evening. I'm going to be talking about a book I wrote called The New Black Vanguard, Photography Between Art and Fashion, that I published with Aperture in 2019. And, you know, we started work on this book with like a series of questions, right? We were sort of thinking about the ways in which there was this young group of photographers who didn't really know each other at the time, who were just creating these desperate images, right? And posting them online, and posting them on Tumblr and printing them out and doing shows in their houses. And, and I was just sort of seeing this, as a writer and a curator. And then Aperture sort of approached me and said, would I write a book for them? And what would that book be? And so I was like, well, it makes probably the most sense is to sort of think about the image makers of my generation, to think about sort of the way that they were thinking about sort of big topics like beauty and desire and gender, and how that it all sort of was coalescing around this idea of fashion or dress, right? I didn't necessarily have an interest in sort of the book being about fashion or in sort of a sort of commercial way sense, right? But I was more so driven by these group of what ended up being 15 photographers, and the way that they were sort of thinking about sort of these notions of themselves and their community, right? And so they weren't necessarily thinking about sort of capital C community, or thinking about their communities, right? And these image makers who are from Lagos and London and Georgia and California and some New York and just about every place in between, were sort of thinking about like my family or, their families, or they're thinking about sort of their sexuality, or they're thinking about masculinity, or thinking about, what is beautiful, what isn't beautiful, thinking about sort of being left out of certain spaces like magazines or museums or galleries. But they all were sort of coalescing around this, but the way they were sort of presenting or producing those images were sort of within sort of the context of fashion, right? And so I was sort of more interested in that. And as we sort of started the process and sort of started to, just comb through, folks' Instagrams and Twitters and, Tumblrs, and because that's the sort of, that was the, I think it's sort of interesting that was the platform that they were, publishing on, because those are the platforms that were sort of just available to them, right? I think that if we think about photography, we really sort of have to think about sort of the way that technology sort of moves that medium forward. And for these sort of young photographers, I mean, the youngest one was Cole Lemons at the time, who was 21, and the oldest one being Awal Arisku, who's 36, right, today. And that sort of gap and sort of difference in life experience was so varied, right? But again, they sort of kept coming back to this notion of photography and what was possible. Campbell Addy is a photographer, one of the British photographers that was featured in a book. And when I was sort of interested in the way that sort of Campbell worked, I was particularly interested in the way they were sort of thinking about his own identity, being sort of born and raised in London, but family's heritage in Ghana, right? And sort of the way that he was sort of doing that through dress. Ariel Bob Willis, who just published a really great book with Aperture, Brendan's here, was sort of, the first time that I encountered her work, I wrote this piece for The New Yorker about her work, and she kept talking about sort of painting, right? And she kept talking about folks like Jake Lawrence and talking about the colors in those paintings, right? But she's a photographer. And, and the way that those works sort of psychologically or emotionally made her feel, right? And so Ariel is sort of talking about all that, but it's being sort of produced in, or expressed through, the sort of, the use of clothing as a device, because I think one of the things that is interesting about that book and interesting about the way that these photographers have worked is that, that sort of between, right, art and fashion, right? There's this long debate about, commercial, photography and art photography, and the two should never meet, and, whatever. And I just was sort of interested in the fact that these image makers were just sort of throwing that stuff out of the door. We're sort of, sidestepping those long debates, those long histories, and sort of just making what they wanted to make. And at a time where they didn't really kind of have a lot of access to sort of more institutionalized spaces, right, in terms of, galleries, museums, and even like publishing, right? And so, like there's also Micaiah Carter, who's a Los Angeles, who grew up in LA, went to school here. Again, sort of, and I was also very interested in like the way that these images, like removing the images out of sort of the context in which they were sort of produced, sort of make them something else, right? And so like, and since the publishing of this book, like the image on the left here of a French singer that I'm forgetting her name at the moment, but like it's become like the cover of someone's novel. It's become the cover of someone's album. Like there's these sort of lives to fashion images or fashionable images that sort of seem to live beyond just whatever the photographer's intent is. And I think that that sort of tension that exists within those images and the way that they sort of sometimes become advertisements or become these fashion shoots in magazines, or sometimes ends up in, magazine works that then go onto museum walls that then are sold at galleries. Like there's these sort of the way that the traveling of that and the tension that creates was sort of interesting to me as sort of the writer of the book, which was not necessarily sort of questions that the photographers were concerned with. They just wanted to make their images, right? And someone, and I was also interested in sort of dialogues, right? The historical dialogue. Someone like Awal Arisku, this is a great sort of example of that, right? So you have, Awal, who grew up in New York City, lives in Los Angeles, family heritage is, from Ethiopia, right? And in the way that Awal works, and many of you who are friends of mine know Awal quite well, but the way that AWOL works, he's sort of thinking about sort of the history of photography, right? So if you're sort of looking at, the way that he's using sort of this color card, right? Like he's sort of thinking about that, it's broken. You can sort of talk about that in sort of 1,000 different ways, but then he's also thinking about sort of the history of sort of African and African-American culture with the use of sort of King Tut and also, Nefertiti, but then also, the way that he uses these particular flowers, which are, flowers that sort of symbolizes rebirth, right? And so but then it's all within a still life photograph, right? And so like within all of that, he's sort of not only talking about photography, his own heritage, but also, sort of the Nefertiti that's on the left that he's painted black, that is shipped away, to sort of talk about, notions of identity. And so I just found that like these image makers were sort of working in this way that was a lot more layered, and I wanted to sort of bring them together in a way that allowed for a discussion about what is, if we're going to call an image a fashion image, what is that image? What does that image does? What does it do in the culture? And how do folks, respond to it? Quill Lemons, who's the youngest photographer in the book, he's from Philadelphia, lives in New York City, but, did this whole sort of images using these dresses where he had his great-grandmother and his youngest sister sort of playing in those dresses, right? To sort of talk about sort of, home, notions of home, giving like the traditional, style of this dress, but also to talk about sort of, the way that like different generations, sort of communicate and live and et cetera. But that's all sort of within a fashion photograph, right? And so I think what was sort of interesting about these image makers is the way that they were sort of using, fashion photography, like whatever you sort of think that is or can be, but then sort of inscribing it with their own sort of notions around their communities, their identities, and what do they want to sort of say in the world. Ronell Madrino, New York-based photographer, but again, there are all of these sort of artists who might live somewhere or sort of Black identity might be rooted in one city, but have these sort of like connections elsewhere, like Ronell, who, shoots a lot of her work in the Caribbean because her family heritage is from there. And then we have, Tyler, who we've all talked about, and so I'll just spend a second on Tyler's work. This, I encountered Tyler's work before he really started making images, because he reached out to me, he had to be 21, and asked, to have lunch. We had lunch, and he goes, I want to be an artist, and I want, and he's sort of going through all the things he wanted to do, right? And I was like, okay, do you have pictures? Can you show me some pictures? That sort of thing. And he's like, yeah, and so he like takes out the images and starts showing the images, and we started sort of collaborating on, on his work and showing his work. And one of the first shows that we did together was actually at Aperture. And it was a show called Way We Live Now. And Shakif was actually also in that show. I believe it was in 2018. And we were sort of thinking about sort of in a global way how sort of young photographers were thinking through photography, whatever that meant to them, right? And so this is one of the images that was in that book or in that show that Tyler shot, and it has to do with these sort of notions of masculinity that he's sort of constantly sort of thinking about. And then you had other photographers, Jamal, who's from South Africa, and I was sort of really interested in sort of like the socio-political sort of situations in which these images were made. Some of them were made on iPhones, some of them were made on point and shoot cameras, some of them made sort of really sophisticated cameras, et cetera, just given sort of what the photographers had at their disposal, right? And Jamal is someone who I was really drawn to just because he was his sort of thing was like capturing sort of young South African culture in artists. And so he would capture musicians and painters and sort of as a way to, what we would always talk about is sort of the way you sort of fight photography with photography, right? And Daniel Bassi, Nigerian photographer. And so it really, the new Black Vanguard, to wrap up here, it was really sort of a project, the exhibition and the book, about sort of globally thinking about sort of what young Black photographers were doing and are doing, and how they're working, within and beyond the sort of current constraints. And one of the great sort of, again, Russo Sai, and I think that's what's, if I can go back for a second, what's sort of interesting, I also wanted to show the way that, like, in one city, usually, there's this thing that happens where photographers maybe might be from the same community or same city or might know each other, and then you sort of throw blackness on top of that, and it sort of becomes this thing where it's like supposed to be like this grand statement. And I wanted to show within the book that photographers who might know each other or might be from the same city, they have different concerns, and while they might be still talking about sort of notions like beauty and desire, right? And so you have someone like Ruth, but also Daniel, who are sort of thinking about, Nigeria and Lagos and, that city in just dramatically different ways, right? And again, Ariel, Dana, Stephen, and, just to sort of conclude, that project really, I think, was important to me, and I think to the photographers, because it was, I think, one of the first books, for this generation of image makers to really sort of put them in dialogue around notions of, not only their own work, but how their work sort of is in relationship to sort of a larger community, right? I can go on, clearly. And I'm going to introduce Collier Schorr as the next speaker. Thank you.
Otherwise known as Collier. I chose to put 1,000 images because that's my style. But I wanted to read something that Bell Hooks wrote or said. The camera could function as a political instrument, a way to resist misrepresentation. And okay, you can start my parade of slides. So I thought that was so interesting because I got into this game for representational issues. This was the first picture I did, and it was from a Calvin Klein ad. And it was before I was an artist, but I really was operating in what felt like a very straight, very white, with a strong, side room of gay men. And so I wasn't even an artist, but I just felt like, the only dyke I knew was Dyke Blair. And then I got into it. And when I think about fashion, I mean, I took pictures out of magazines when I was like 15 and just lived with models and told my parents I wanted to be a fashion photographer, but that was a lie. I just wanted a girlfriend. But I never thought to be a fashion photographer. It's kind of ironic that I started doing that. But for 10 years, I made art, which was in my studio, and it was for galleries and museums, and I had no preparation for it. I went to journalism school. And at some point, I think I did something for Purple magazine, and I started making fashion very discreetly because I was slightly ashamed and I thought it would ruin my art career. And about by the time I got really good at it, no one cared. There was like so many collaborations in fashion. This picture from Saint Laurent was kind of a real changing point for me because when I saw it as a billboard, that's when I really kind of moved over because all I had been interested in was representation. And a billboard in a fashion magazine and the New York Times were all much bigger vehicles to talk about what I was interested in. This is a shoot where I started shooting her, the props girl, at the same time and realized I was going to make a project out of it. And so for every shoot I had done in Europe, I would take pictures of her on and off the sets. So I was literally doing 2 shoots at the same time, which was a good use of my mind. This is a new book I'm working on that focuses on trans men, women, butch dykes, and non-binary women. No gay men, unless they're no cis gay men unless they're dating trans men. That's my favorite thing right now. One of the reasons I put a lot of pictures up is because I meet people in different places and bring them into other different places, and I don't think about these things as fashion photographs necessarily. I think about them as pictures of people with clothes that appear in different places, and or sometimes they have no clothes. But these are almost all from my phone, which is amazing. I guess, like, for me, the representation, misrepresentation is really of interest because sometimes I really feel like, what the fuck am I doing? You know, and sometimes I feel really good about it. And then sometimes later I think, oh, I'm finally free. But I don't see, that's Alvin Bishop. I know I had it right. This was one of my favorite shoots with Zoe Kravitz where I said, let's shoot you like a trans man, a trans woman. Like I was thinking about those pictures on the piers and the way in which trans women could show their bodies in a way that cis women felt like they couldn't, or that you couldn't look at them in the same way. And it was amazing to work with her because she really understood that. She really wanted to show her body, and she wanted to show it in a different context. And so sometimes the fashion shoot is, you know, I know who I want to shoot, but I don't know exactly how I want to shoot them until I see the clothes. And when I shot Amelia, I know, I love that. When I shot Amelia Gray, you know, very like well photographed person, I really thought that's going to be a real challenge for me. And then when I came in and the clothes were basically like underwear, I was kind of fucked. So I talked to her for a minute and she said, God, no one ever wants to do anything with me. And I thought, well, let's fucking play. Like, you know, let's have you actually perform, be a performance artist, and I can work with you like we're doing a work for an audience, not that you are a prop for the audience. And look how fast it went. I'm just going to talk for another minute, just to say that that was a really weird idea. I was like, what if Sam Wagstaff pushed Robert Mapplethorpe out of the room and started taking pictures of the men that he took pictures of? But all those things kind of, you know, happen because the standard photo shoot is generally of little interest to me. It's like, how can I go in there and fuck around? And, you know, which is the same thing I did when I first started making art, you know, it was to really say, I don't know how I belong here, and I don't have, there's not a lesbian hierarchy that is going to funnel anything for me, which is the truth. You know, it barely exists. And so there has to be, like, you literally have to do 20 years in order to push your thing through, because there's not a lot of adoption. But what that gives you is the chance to make your work and to pretty much learn to collaborate with all these people that aren't like you until you get to kind of be with people that are like you. Thank you. I'm so sorry. My esteemed colleague, Elizabeth Brown.
That was amazing. This is all amazing. I'm trying to focus on what I'm supposed to be doing here, but let me move along. Hopefully there's a picture. Okay, so what would a queer theory of fashion photography look like? This was the modest question I was asked to address today. So to sketch out a quick answer, let me just put two ideas together. First idea, I propose the scholar Kathy Cohen's definition of the term queer. Drawing on Black lesbian feminist thought, she argues for an intersectional definition of queer that brings together all those whose sexuality puts them at odds with the state. As she wrote, quote, I'm talking about a politics where the non-normative and marginal position of punks, bulldaggers, and welfare queens, for example, she's writing in the 90s, is the basis for transformative coalition work. Here, queerness challenges the full range of norms that structure power across race, class, gender, sexuality. Second idea, and we've seen this already, fashion photography is a form of collaboration. In recent years, scholars and photographers have invited us to rethink the history of photography as collaboration. Every photograph is a shared event involving not just the photographer, but also the sitter, the stylist, the editor, and other cultural intermediaries, as well, of course, as the reviewer, all of whom help shape the meaning of the image. Collaboration is not optional, it's constitutive of photography. So a queer theory of fashion photography brings these two concepts together. It looks beyond questions of individual identity to examine how queer, coalitional, collaborative practices make new ways of seeing and new worlds possible. So what does this look like historically? And here are three moments that suggest some possibilities. Let's take the interwar period in U.S. fashion photography. Some of Collier's favorite folks, the cis gay men of the interwar era. Anyway, these 5 gay photographers defined a queer aesthetics of fashion photography in New York, London, Paris, Hollywood in the years before World War II. George Platt Lynes was a key figure in this queer fashion kinship network. Although he's known primarily today for his portraits of nude men as well as other work, he was also a prominent fashion photographer in the 30s and 40s for Condé Nast and for Harper's Bazaar, where the erotics of the queer gaze informed his fashion work. Lynes' queer kinship network played a central role in establishing the model's look in the interwar period. Pretty much every element of these images represents queer collaboration, from the model Ruth Ford's career, to the photographs themselves, to the striped dress designed by gay surrealist painter Pavel Chelichev, whose life partner Charles Henry Ford was Ruth's brother. I could go on and on about the images. My point is simply that queer collaboration is central to the history of interwar fashion photography. So let's shift our focus from photographers to modeling agencies, keeping collaboration in view. After World War II, with the growth of Black consumer spending and the persistence of Jim Crow, Black modeling agencies emerged to connect Black models to both product advertisers and fashion designers. These modeling agencies are an example of queerness in the Kathy Cohen sense, which is non-normative in the context of structural racism in mid-20th century fashion. The two major Black modeling agencies were run by Barbara Watson and Ophelia DeVore. And Sarah Lou Harris, who we see here, was the most famous Black photographic model in the 1950s. She expertly created a discourse of glamorous beauty that drew on an older class-inflected politics of Black respectability. Black modeling agencies represented couture models mainly in Europe, as the U.S. mainstream fashion industry refused to book Black models until the late 60s. Grace Del Marco Agency represented both Dorothea Towles after she returned from Paris, where she had modeled for Dior, and also Beverly Valdez, the first Black model to be hired by a US-based couture designer in 1961. My final example is the collaboration between Richard Avedon and Danielle Luna for the April 1965 issue of Harper's Bazaar, which Avedon guest edited with London-based gay designer Nikki Haslam. These images are part of the first editorial fashion photographs featuring a Black model to appear in an elite white US fashion magazine. Luna had been meant to model Manbouche designs, but when he refused to allow a Black model to wear them, Avedon asked Pauline Trégère, Bill Blass, and James Galanos to create new dresses for her to model. And in this series, two outsiders, a queer, closeted Jewish photographer, and a lanky, elegant Black girl from Detroit, invent a new vocabulary for Black glamour in the context of white print culture and systemic racism in US fashion. So a queer theory of fashion photography shows us that how style becomes a site of refusal and reinvention, where power is rerouted through collaboration and beauty becomes a collective act. From the margins, new worlds are modeled. Thank you very much. my pleasure to invite Troy Keith to come up.
Hello. So cute. In my debut monograph, Notes Towards Becoming a Spill, published by Aperture, I open with a photograph of myself as a toddler dressed in a tuxedo. In my hands, I'm holding my grandmother's Kodak film. Beyond its sentimental value, I return to this image often because it doesn't merely capture something sweet. It captures a formation. It is an image of boyhood staged through the lens of decorum, of polish, of neatness, of imagined wholeness. The performance of gender, the costume of masculinity, arrives early here, but it is not self-authored. It is instructed, imposed, desired on behalf of the child. This image does not simply depict the boy, it reveals the discipline of being made into one. But then that body, years later, bears the burden of that early performance. In this photograph, books on spirituality, psychoanalysis, and the Black masculine body are stacked atop the subject's head. Here, knowledge is not simply liberatory, it becomes a burden. History pressing into flesh. The work holds a question. What is the cost of being made legible in the eyes of others? I like to think I get closer to an answer with this photograph of Prince. The subject appears with his mouth open, eyes closed, his body suspended in a state of ecstatic vulnerability. This is not the polished, composed image we're taught to recognize as portraiture, as manhood. The frame does not seek to flatter, nor does it aspire to elegance or control. Here, the image releases the posture and coherence once held by me as a tuxedo toddler. What once reached for wholeness now sweats. It says, "Let me break." And yet, what I intended in making these photos is not collapse, it's refusal. A refusal to perform, to conform, or to resolve within the visual structures that demand clarity. This is where the spill was born for me, a refusal to be contained, a way in being that leaks, stretches, and slips beyond the limits of representation. In these photographs, the body is no longer bound by the discipline of form. It trembles, it shimmers, it haunts. What remains is effective residue, the emotional trace of something deeply felt, but impossible to fully articulate. This is where polish disintegrates. The neatness of gendered form begins to buckle. What emerges instead is something excessive, spiritual, fugitives, and irreducibly queer. The apparition, the mourner, the blues. These are not postures of resolution, but acts of visual misbehavior. They break with the codes of masculinity and visual pleasure. These figures don't offer legibility, they trouble it. To spill is not to style the Black queer body, but to let it resist style altogether, to break form, to move, to refuse to hold still. To allow boundlessness to take shape, where the body no longer performs for recognition, but settles into the threshold. It offers no contours, no clarity, not absence, but density, not visibility, but presence that lingers, pulses, and resists transition. This is not fashion. This is flesh. Thank you. Tanya.
Good evening. Since I'm a design curator and not a photography or fashion expert, I would like to take you on a brief visual journey to share some thoughts on the multiple roles that design and architecture play in fashion photography. We start with cities and their landmarks, which are used frequently to embed the garments in intriguing stories. Paris, for example, the world capital of fashion, with its iconic Eiffel Tower, is the perfect setting to convey romance, glamour, and joie de vivre. Another popular example is Venice. Its maritime flair and medieval churches were selected, among others, by Christian Dior as a picturesque backdrop for his elegant creations from 1951. Hedi Slimane, on the other hand, turned to the edgy city of Berlin to stage his equally edgy menswear collection for Celine in 2019. And in this fashion editorial for the Italian Grazia, Hong Kong's Jardine House, with its sleek geometric facade, became the background for stylish designer looks in silver and white. The unique flair of each city sets the tone. The same goes for iconic buildings like the Eames House, built in 1949. A synonym for the laid-back Californian lifestyle that became so popular in mid-century America, it was the perfect set for this Vogue summer editorial shot in 1954. Pipsan Saarinen Swanson's Sol Air Chaise Longue was used in a similar way, promoting not only the newest beach fashions, but also the latest lifestyle trends. Icons of mid-century modern design are still popular props today, only now they're used to create a distinctively retro atmosphere, as seen in this 70s fashion editorial from 2015. The fact that Eero Saarinen's womb chair and Harry Bertoya's diamond chair weren't actually designed in the 1970s doesn't really matter, because it's more about the mood. This also applies to Takashi Homa's street-style-like editorial for the magazine Many of Them. It features buildings from architects of the Japanese metabolist movement to underscore the futuristic appeal of Paco Rabanne's designs. The emphasis changes when design and architecture are linked to the distinctive aesthetic philosophy of a brand. In this 1995 Comme des Garçons campaign, Hong Kong's dense and multi-layered urban landscape acts almost like an architectural counterpart or reflection to Rei Kawakubo's deconstructed and similarly layered garments. Meanwhile, Annie Leibovitz turned to icons of modernism to capture Phoebe Philo's first collection for Celine, emphasizing the refined minimalist aesthetic for which Philo has since become so famous. And in Jill Sanders' Spring-Summer 2020 campaign, Ludovico Quaroni's utopian Chiesa Madre echoes the brand's signature look of progressive timelessness. Equally fascinating are photographs in which design, architecture, and fashion enter into a carefully constructed dialogue. In this striking photograph by Franz Christian Gundlach, Isamu Noguchi's rice paper lamps mirror the delicate pleats of the black dress. And in this editorial for Vogue China, the structured shoulders of the Balmain mini dress are amplified by the dynamic curves of Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. Then there are shots in which design and architecture seem to take center stage. In another image by Gundlach, the black ensemble looks rather modest in comparison to Oscar Niemeyer's spectacular residence for the Brazilian president. And in Helmut Newton's Office Love, the Eames soft-pad chairs and Gaolenti's Pipistrello lamp feel far more important than the clothes, given that they provide the visual anchor points for the juicy love affair that we get to witness. Finally, we arrive at images in which the hierarchy between the garments and their setting becomes irrelevant. Instead of being presented by models and interpreted through storytelling, the clothes become part of elaborate still lifes, as in this work by the Dutch duo Scheltens and Avedon. Or, in an even more stripped-down version, only the clothes remain, and suddenly they are shown for what they truly are, beautiful design objects. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Next. Ooh, okay. Well, you'll do that. And next up is Nick Vogelson. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Nick Vogelson, founder and editor-in-chief of Document Journal. It's an honor to speak among fellow image makers, thinkers, visual investigators, people who understand that fashion photography isn't just about capturing style, but about shaping how we see it, feel, and imagine the world around us. From the start, Document has lived in the interstitial between art, fashion, literature, and in that space, something happens, tension, resistance, and sometimes new ideas. I've always been drawn to where these cultural forces and subcultures germinate. We created Document as a platform to hold contradictions between beauty and critique, surface and depth, fashion and philosophy. We weren't interested in tracking trends or selling clothes. We were interested in dialogue. We asked, what does it mean to make an image now? How can fashion photography offer not just a mirror, but a challenge to the systems that define identity, desire, and worth? Through collaborations with artists such as Collier, Wolfgang Tillmans, Tyler Mitchell, Jürgen Teller, Richard Prince, Lorna Simpson, Paul McCarthy, and on, we've explored that tension. We've sought out photographers who operate in that in-between, where boundaries blur between the intimate and the public, the political and the sensual, asking us to slow down and consider what's shown and what's withheld. I've always loved print for its the sequencing that it allows, for the way contradictory ideas can live side by side, connected by a thread of discovery. What we've learned is this: at its best, fashion photography isn't just a vehicle for style, it's a language. One that's evolving, fractured, refracted through new technologies and desires. The last 2 decades have radically reshaped how images are made, circulated, consumed. And the rise of digital media has democratized authorship. The magazine cover, once a symbol of top-down authority, now shares space with the Instagram grid, the TikTok feed, the selfie as protest or performance. Everyone's a publisher. Everyone curates their self. The destabilizing is both exhilarating and unsettling. As the infrastructures of fashion and media collapse and regenerate, the visual field is flooded with images, and yet the hunger for meaning, images that do more than just decorate, has never felt more urgent. We still crave images that do all the hard work of representation, storytelling, and vision. Over the last decade, I've been particularly interested in subcultures because I feel that these are a space where new ideas can germinate and grow before they're absorbed and collapsed into the mainstream dialogues. This was a series that I commissioned with the photographer Luke Guilford back in 2018 of queer cowboys in Texas that went on to become a film that he made, his directorial debut. Another photographer that I've worked with quite a lot, Lawrence Ellis, a British documentary photographer. During the pandemic, I commissioned him to find rave communities that were happening throughout the pandemic. These kids who had nothing to do and were risking everything and throwing parties in the middle of the woods. He stayed up till 5 a.m. to get a phone call about where to go and then drove for 3 hours to shoot this. We did an issue on what America means today, and I thought nothing typifies America more than nudist communities. So we sent Lawrence down to Florida. He photographed there for a week, and midway through, he called me and he said, "Nick, do you mind if I take my clothes off?" And I said, "Be one with the community." We shot Jodie Foster with Wolfgang Tillmans on Fire Island, a place heavy with queer memory, light with ocean air, and charged with quiet rebellion. Jodie brings an intensity, a grace that holds chaos of the moment. It's not just a portrait, it's a meditation on legacy, queerness, and soft power. When I reached out to Wolfgang to shoot this, I sent him an email and I got a phone call 5 minutes later. I've never had that happen before. He said, yes, absolutely, we have to do it on Fire Island. Jodie had never been to Fire Island before. While we were doing production for the shoot, I thought I was getting her a water taxi, something very discreet, and they ended up getting her the entire Fire Island ferry with only her on it. These are not just images, they're collaborations, and not in the logo collaboration sense. These are partnerships that reject extraction and embrace shared authorship. They honor the labor behind the images, the stylists, the casting directors, the subjects, the retouchers, the editors, all co-creating meaning. Fashion has always been a site of tension between survival and spectacle, between rewriting the rules and reinforcing them. Queer communities in particular have used image making as both armor and invitation. Each issue of Document is built around a theme, more like a symposium than a traditional magazine structure. Our issue on identity, for example, aimed to document human experience across all ages. We paired Jürgen Teller's baby photograph of his young daughter with Joan Jonas, shot by Jamie Hawksworth. Sometimes the most radical gesture fashion can make is to bring joy. That image, absurd, irreverent, sincere, reminds us that beauty can be fragile, funny, and full of potential, that it doesn't have to perform. Jürgen was so excited by the idea that he went on to create a whole series around recreating his famous photographs with a daughter. To me, that's the radical potential of fashion photography, and one I see embraced by new generations of photographers working collectively with care and softness, slowness, often outside of commercial systems. The shift is not just aesthetic, it's structural. It reimagines the image not as a product, but as a process, a site of collaboration, a place to ask, what does it mean to be vulnerable? What does it mean to be visible? Photographers like Tyler, who we've all mentioned, are leading the way, telling stories rooted in softness, discovery, and refusal. These images don't just look different, they feel different. They make space for complexity. This was Erica Badu, photographed at her home in Dallas. Joshua Woods, another close collaborator, brings great sensitivity and creativity to his images, whether transforming Michelene Thomas into the supermodel Mickey, or photographing Solange at the Glass House. Fashion photography has always dealt in fiction, constructed characters, conjuring mood, building atmosphere. But fiction isn't the opposite of truth. Often fiction is the only way to express truths too complex to state plainly. In this way, the fashion image becomes a speculative space. It doesn't just show the world as it is, it proposes how it could be. We're now launching our newest title, Notes on Beauty. Here, beauty is not only a starting point, it's essentially a peripheral subject. If Document is about culture at large and the external world, Notes on Beauty is inward-facing. It's about self-discovery. We weren't interested in answering the question, what is beauty? We wanted to ask better ones. The first issue centers on themes of desire and devotion, exploring cultural and artistic portrayals of love, identity, and becoming. It's about individual beauty, not standardized ideals. It's about being a role model for self-realization. In the debut portfolio by Inez and Vinood, we explored 20 individuals across 4 generations who each exemplify their own journey of love and self-discovery. We explore queer communities in Côte d'Ivoire. We revisit Dietmar Bousset's seminal series, My Life as a Flower, a project he began in the 90s and has recently returned to for our debut issue. At both Document and Notes on Beauty, we live in the in-between, between fashion and art, commercial and critique, surface and soul. We believe fashion photography can whisper, shimmer, seduce, and resist. I think we're left with the question, not the answer. The fashion image at its most vital doesn't resolve the contradictions of race, gender, class, and power. It reveals them. It gives form to our desires, our anxieties, our longing for something more. It opens a space for who we are and who we might become. And in that in-between space, between fiction and fact, beauty and critique, we begin to imagine other ways of seeing, other ways of being. Thank you. I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Rocio.
Thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. I'm so honored to be among this beautiful panel of speakers, so thank you, Roxanne and Caitlin. With my 5 minutes, I'd like to touch on the work of two artists of two different generations, both of them exploring the intersection of art making and high fashion. Puerto Rican and Dominican American, active in different moments, I see both artists as ultimately visualizing bodily autonomy and queer and Black liberation. Known under the single name Antonio, Juan Ramos and Antonio Lopez worked together for over 4 decades, remaking fashion illustration and fashion photography into a space of freedom. These spaces were inhabited by Black, Latinx, and Native American and genderqueer models, breakdancers from the South Bronx, and entertainers from his homeland, Puerto Rico. Juan and Antonio consistently employed models that were racially and ethnically marginalized in the world of high fashion, bringing names like Tina Chow, Grace Jones, Tukey Smith, and Pat Cleveland with them, and helping to discover many others of diverse backgrounds. They found as much inspiration on the streets and in the nightclubs as in art history books. As Antonio himself has noted, when I came into fashion illustration, it was a dead art. Real boring, catalog-y, very waspy. I gave it a transfusion. In drawings and photographs, Lopez created visual narratives in which statuesque bodies of varied ethnicities and races were featured as protagonists. His love for Puerto Rico is evinced by the work surrounding an issue of Interview magazine with loving tributes to Iris Chacon, Rita Moreno, and the landscapes of the island. The lush vegetation appears frequently in the instamatics that he took for this issue of Interview. As a teacher at FIT, Antonio brought break dancers to class with him. The Rocksteady crew were regularly invited to perform as part of lectures, acknowledging the importance of hip-hop and breakdance on his work. After doing his live drawing demonstration to students, Antonio would introduce the dancers, saying that their moves and their energy were deeply important to his way of working. Early works by the duo featured a juxtaposition of the invisible labor of the fashion industry as captured by Juan's photography. These photos would become the backdrops for illustrations from the late 1960s and show fashion workers, men loading and unloading trucks, moving clothing racks, in and out of loading docks, resting momentarily. This discourse on race and class ended up in the New York Times Fashion magazine because it was submitted at the very last minute, too late for editorial censorship. Working since 2012 on her project, The Supper Club, artist Elia Alba, who's with us tonight in the middle of the audience, has invited over 50 artists of color to pose in images inspired by the pages of Vanity Fair and Vogue. Among the artists featured in the series are Micheline Thomas, LaToya Ruby Frazier, Derek Adams, Abigail DeVille, Syle Wolfach, and many others. Each figure is represented in costume and setting that represents their unique artistic voice and is intended as a visual embodiment of their work. The series was accompanied by a set of dinners cooked by the artist herself in the early days, styled after 19th century salons and featuring guided conversations on race, gender, and the power dynamics of the art world. The styling of the artists, the costumes, often made by Elia herself, and carefully orchestrated scenes are the culmination of hours of labor and oftentimes the wait for the perfect weather conditions. Some of the more elaborate works take cues from pop culture or the history of painting, as in this image of the painter David Antonio Cruz, styled as one of the Greco saints, or the Dominican American sisters Sherizade and Ileana Garcia, reminiscent of the two Fridas. Working to correct the legacies of invisibility, these artist projects become significant for their representations of diverse and individual identities. They are critical of the moment in which they live and work, and to the expansion of artistic strategies and narratives. Taken together, the imagery of Antonio and Elia shows us as audience to muse freely, seeing the potential of artistic freedom of expression as a way to imagine a more equitable world, and maybe to create a more feminist, multicultural, multiracial democracy. Thank you. And next, Camila Falques.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having us here. This is very exciting to be surrounded by so many people I admire and whose work I'm deeply inspired by. Thank you. I am Camila Falques. I'm a photographer living and working in New York from Colombian, Spanish, and Mexican roots. For the past 10 years, I have been photographing people from many walks of life, always interested in photography as a medium to experiment visually with the collective understandings of beauty, power, and possibility. Fashion photography and portraiture have become my grounds for these experiments, and in a way, also my ground for a particular form of gathering that I read Carrie Mae Weems talk about in her essay Compassion. She says, "So if there's a beauty and elegance that allows for myself and the viewer to be engaged, then I have a sense that you'll be more willing to enter a terrain and ask the difficult questions once you're there." The questions she's referring to come from observing in the beautiful something else, something that can confront imperial and colonial limited thinking with an underlying liveness that was never supposed to still be here. I think my career as I know it started with my project Being in 2018. Being is a multifaceted photography portrait series spanning multiple years, in which I photograph humans from diverse backgrounds, trans people, disabled people, elder women, trans families, long etc. there. For these portraits, I started putting together seemingly disconnected visual ideas, some that I had learned in European art history and its way of depicting beauty, and some I learned in the traditional fashion industry's obsession with aspirationality, material aspirationality. But in this case, these ideas were being held by subjects who had long survived in the margins, who had endured in the invisibles, sustaining lives in ways I had never seen before in fashion and art history's depictions of beauty. In that crossing of visual ideas, something new seemed to emerge in my path. And I want to take a moment to say that it's in my path, but it's also in the path of so many other artists that we are walking alongside with, that I don't want to not mention because I'm deeply inspired by so many others' work. For the project, I asked the subjects in the photographs to help put into words what we were doing by creating something we called a collective manifesto. And I would like to take as a starting point for this talk what poet and performer Alok Menon added to this text. They wrote, "We are the embodiment of a new history, a history renowned by reclamation and documentation. We are history." And then they say, this is the part, "By being, we manifest the impossible." I want to take this opportunity today to look into this impossible Alok surfaced with their words. What specific potential is this impossible referring to? Since then, my work has been about finding the conditions to glimpse, even if briefly, the impossible that emerges abundantly from that crossing of visual narratives. With time and across multiple portrait series, I have come to understand that the impossible is the moment in which a photograph can open a break in our imaginations, in our capacity to find the right questions and answers to protect and acknowledge historically erased livelihoods. This impossible moment can emerge from a symbolic collision from past and present, power and vulnerability, abundance and scarcity, joy and tragedy, and can all be held within an image and within the same moment. But this moment needs to be brief, needs to be in movement in order to protect what is being magically revealed to us. This break this space for asking questions that Carrie Mae Weems talks about, this glimpse into the cracks holds in my way of seeing it, all the impossibles. Queens and kings that inhabit the undercommons, ancestral knowledge, gods and goddesses. From this idea emerged the name of my first solo show, Gods That Walk Among Us. But history now, currently, is telling us that this knowledge is too powerful, too beautiful, too threatening. And as the world evolves into this unknown we're all being witnesses about, I have been wondering how to protect those that become visible when the break opens generously, showing this joy, this freedom, this other possibility or impossibility. The mechanics of the break, fortunately and unfortunately, must remain a mystery. Only sometimes, only when needed, only in the right time, must the break abundantly allow for us to witness and see the impossible. To close this brief encounter, I want to talk about something that Didi Uberman, the philosopher, says. And as I was I'm currently in a state of desperation, looking for ways to approach my practice in this current world. A dear friend recommended his book, The Survival of the Fireflies, which I really recommend. In it, Didi Habermas refers to the firefly knowledge as the clandestine knowledge, the knowledge of the realities constantly submitted to censorship. Regarding this, he says, we must ourselves, in retreat from the kingdom and the glory, in the open gap between past and future, or in this break, this impossible, this place to gather that Carrie Mae Weems talks about, become fireflies, and thus form again a community of desire, a community of flashes shining out, a dance in spite of all, of thoughts to transmit. Thank you very much. And I want to welcome Sarah Sinar.
I'm going to start with a video clip from my most recent project called Baby Blue Benzo. And so this is a 1.5-minute excerpt of a 20-minute film.
It was a car, a dream car, a good image. Sometimes the desire felt like hunger. Sometimes it felt like dread. Often it felt like nothing. Out here browsing the aisles, it was easy to forget that we still want what others do not have. The power of the fantasy bribe was wearing out. It makes it hard to sleep. The attrition of the fantasy, of a collectively invested form of life. So a sustaining inclination to return to the scene of fantasy every night. And expect that things might be different this time. 114, take 2, bag 1.
0 hour.
I have a car for you, unique, unlike any other. The 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR.
Oops. Okay, well, it wasn't really supposed to end there, but here we are. Okay, so this is a film that I just finished last year as part of a larger project that was shown at 52 Walker in New York. And it begins with my obsession with this object of the Benz and a larger investigation into photography and this type of advertising imagery. So it starts with the car, which is the most expensive car ever sold for 135 million euros in 2022. And it expands this object into a research film about the arbitrariness of value, the question of how something could become that expensive, and the way that photography serves capitalism as a creator of desire. In the film, I link the Benz to benzodiazepines, which is medication, yes, that everyone is familiar with, I guess. But for those who aren't, that is prescribed for anxiety and insomnia, which is a lifelong struggle of mine. I tie my own intense states of being awake to the uninterrupted thrum of 21st century life and connect the advent of photography to the development of the Fordist assembly line, which changed the way that modern subjects saw themselves and their own productivity and purchasing power. The work also includes a Pamela Anderson photo shoot, a scene at a Mercedes-Benz corporate museum in Germany, and a dream sequence of ice skaters in Marlboro car racing costumes. The film is about surrealism, sleeplessness, and the idea that late capitalism feels like a dream already, where the mashup of images and information that we see every day walking down the street or opening our phones is unlike anything we could have imagined before recent history outside of a dream. It is about design, fashion, desire, beauty, and sleep as the only autonomous space where technology can't get you. These are some of the install shots of the show. So the video is in this central space, and it was surrounded by corridors of images, both framed and unframed photographs, and these wallpapers that were made of tiled together office copier prints. The wallpapers included a giant reproduction of the car, an AI version of Pamela Anderson, and the official promotional photo for the condo building that was built outside my studio window while I was making the film. The framed photographs include images of costumes from a famous LA costume rental house for extras, a collage built over an archival picture of a doll modeling an 18th century French fashion, and remakes of photographs that I find on e-commerce sites. When I was making this film, I was thinking a lot about the intrinsic link between photography and desire. And I was referring a lot to Lauren Berlant's idea of cruel optimism. Cruel optimism is described as a phenomena that first emerged in the 1980s in North America and Europe, when people were holding fast to post-war notions of the good life. So upward mobility, equality, and love, even as these ideals became increasingly out of step with reality. Berlant points out that we become attached to smaller pleasures, like the purchase of a new pair of shoes, or the outcome of a sporting event, or a small change through an existing channel of government, yet these can prevent us from making meaningful changes to our larger systems and lives. We are held back by the optimisms that comfort us in the present, and photography plays a huge role in this. Photography both sells the good life fantasy and sells the objects and smaller pleasures that come in to replace it when it does not materialize. These desires also keep us connected to the world. As Berlant says, desire is a driving force. It feels good to want things, even an ostensibly unattainable $1 million car. Pamela Anderson is also a key figure in Baby Blue Benzo. The film has a section of behind-the-scenes footage of a shoot I did of her for the New York Times, where she periodically turns on and off her image-ready persona. I also included this still photo of her in the show. For my photo of Pamela, I wanted to think about her value as an object of desire as opposed to the value of the Benz, how her image as a beautiful woman decreased in value with time and age, while the car's value shot up as it got older and more rare. Then in a twist of fate, she was suddenly reevaluated by the culture, although she told me she didn't want to be reevaluated by anyone. I was also thinking about how social media changes our relationships to these larger questions, how it's easy to feel like we might almost know or be Pamela Anderson or almost have a lifestyle that can accommodate $1 million car because we have so much access to these things through images. I rephotographed my picture of Pam with plastic wrap on top. I wanted it to feel like the image had been pulled out of storage, somehow like we threw her away, but then decided she was worth looking at again. But I also wanted to make a beautiful portrait of her, which I do think this is. There's a line at the end of Baby Blue Benzo that is a quote from Roland Barthes' The Fashion System, originally published in 1967. He says, "The ideal woman of fashion is a compound of apparent oppositions. Demure and determined, tender and tough, she gives evidence of a dream of wholeness according to which the human being could be everything at once without ever having to choose. In fashion, the person is thus simultaneously impossible, yet entirely known. Everything is the best in the best of all possible worlds." In my work, I'm trying to think about the good and bad about that, the pleasure in wanting, and also the unattainable ideals and images that keep us cycling through different objects of desire and keep us reaching for things that feel so close but only ever exist as photographs or lines of advertising. Thank you. And I would like to introduce Pauline Vermeer.
Hi, everyone. I'm the last speaker, and I'll try to keep it brief. Thank you, Roxana and Caitlin, for inviting me to talk about, Japanese women photographers in fashion tonight. This invitation came after this book was published. Leslie Martin and I edited the book and curated the show with Mariko Takeuchi that was presented in Arles last year. And in this book and in the show are many photographers who work with fashion. They were either fashion photographers by profession or working with fashion. So here I'll present a few of them, starting with Yoshi Taketa, who worked in the 60s with Pierre Cardin. She became quite well known in Paris. She was very close with Cartier-Bresson and other photographers at the time. And she had a very unique sense. I love the photo on the right, very modern and very almost futuristic style. Yuriko Takagi is also a very well-known Japanese woman photographer who worked in fashion. Until recently, she worked with very many fashion brands, including Dior recently. In the 1990s, a movement started, or a moment arose where many women photographers came to the forefront of Japanese photography, including Hiro Mix. And these photographers were not per se, were not fashion photographers, but were working with fashion. And so from the 90s on, starting with Hiro Mix or Mikani Nagawa, more and more women in Japanese photography started working in between diaristic styles, portraiture, and fashion. And this is a style that has never ended, and today still you find in contemporary photography quite a few Japanese women who work in this in-betweenness. This is another example from the 1990s that was recently included in a show in Kyoto called Love Fashion. This is an iconic piece by Tomoko Sawada, a series of self-portraits called ID 400 that she made in 1998, very much inspired by Cindy Sherman and other photographers at the time. So again, this is not quite fashion photography, but maybe fashioning yourself and looking at fashion to also look at oneself and identity. Later, in the later decades, Monica Mogi worked also with brands such as X-Girl. Rinko Kawauchi worked with Agnès B. This is the cover of the book they did together to celebrate the anniversary of Agnès B's cardigan. But the photographer that I'd like to focus more with this presentation, because she used fashion and she is using fashion in a maybe more personal way, is Mari Katayama. She's the youngest photographer that is in the book and in the exhibition. She was born with an illness that made her bones developed more slowly in her left hand and legs, and at the age of 9, she chose to be amputated. And her prosthetic legs became really the center of her photographic practice. And very quickly, shoes became one of the central elements in her practice. She explained about fashion. She said, "I love fashion, but the reason that I came to fashion myself was because of bullying during my teenage years. I tried to express myself by coloring my prosthetic legs like rainbows, or I did many things with them. Bullies never tried to listen to me. So I thought, if they won't hear my words, I need to let them see my thoughts. So I styled myself pretty uniquely." And here, as you can see over the years, her style has very much, so through self-portraiture and fashion, she really has established a unique style in photography. She's been shown, her work has been shown quite a lot in Japan and in Europe, but not so much yet in the US. So it's a pleasure for me to be able to talk about her and her work here with you all. So shoes were important, and particularly high heels. And she started the series called High Heels that you can see here. And about that series, she said, "I thought if physically challenged people see me in high heels, they may feel strong enough to say, 'Hey, there's a crazy girl, why can't I wear a cool jacket too?' I just wanted to say that we can choose to dress up or not. We have the choice with these high heels." And so she collaborated through the series, she collaborated with a few brands as well. And so this is an ongoing series and one of the latest works that she's been producing. And so for Mari Katayama, fashion it's personal, it's a way of empowerment, self-empowerment, but also empowerment as she talks about how she hopes that her work is going to inspire many more people. So I wanted to bring her up tonight, and I'm happy to leave you with this last thought tonight. Thank you.
Just a very wholehearted thanks to all our contributors this evening. We have reached the conclusion of our time, but I would like to invite everyone to join us for a glass of wine, and we can continue conversation in a more informal way. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.